So now that's cool, but let's try to get a little bit deeper into nutrient cycling, what nutrients, and then health. So what nutrients are in the soil? Well, these are what we call the big boys, the big 13. What are the right forms of these? So nitrogen all the way down to magnesium. So we'll look at that. So that gives us what's called soil chemistry and nutrient pools. So my plant can only take nutrients that are in the nutrient pool within the soil profile. If the nutrient's not there, the plant cannot make it up. It can't get it unless it's already present. And if it's been depleted, like those nutrients are not there because we've been exporting from the same field, a monoculture, for the last 50 years. Well, it exported that nutrient out. So then when we test the plants now, they are all like 40 to 50% from the 1950 state. We've depleted, so if you go buy broccoli today in Whole Foods, it's 50% less iron than it was in 1940. Okay? Well, I'm paying more and I'm getting less. And then I don't know where the broccoli came from most of the time. So I don't know if that farmer, and especially if they're capitalists on this side, they don't have to provide whether it's nutritious. They just have to provide what it looks like. And there's a big difference between what something looks like and its nutrient density. Okay? So that's what we want to look at. So these are called total extractable nutrients. So then we're going to start learning the words that would be used in our soil test so we can understand our soil test, so we can understand how to fix our soils. Also called total exchangeable nutrients. We'll look at the differences. There's the Reams-Morgan extract soluble nutrient test. So this is what they're going to do to test your soils. So you bring your little Ziploc bag of soils to your department or mail it, depending on what country you're in. And they're going to do these tests, and we're going to see what they do. They have plant tissue tests, so they can take the tissue, and then they can try to see the nutrient profile within this tissue, right? So what does that mean? If this is soil, so use this like in a little infographic that's the total amount of soil. The soluble or accessible nutrient, it's always processing through the web, right? So very little of the nutrients are accessible at any one time, but they're always becoming accessible. So the plant's taking them out and more are filling that gap. So we have basically the soluble, that's the white, which is called dissolved in soil condition. The plant has access to that. It can take it. We have exchangeable, which is easily pulled off. So these are like the bacteria is holding the nutrient, but it hasn't made it water soluble yet. It's just stuck in the aggregate. The bacteria had to eat it to pass it, right? So that's available, but they didn't make a drug deal yet. Okay? The other one is paid for. Here's the one that, hey man, I got it, I'm holding. All right, and then the bacteria, fungi, nematodes, all the things living in the soil hold the rest of the nutrients in their bodies, waiting till they die. And then they get moved from death into the red, and the red comes into the white. And that's the kind of concept which is going on. So that's called the total extractable nutrients, which is a grinding complete digestion and combustion. The total exchangeable nutrients is the red, and that's where the bacteria store like their access to minerals. And then we have our Reams-Morgan extractable nutrients, and that's what's made available. So that's the three types of things. So your test is going to tell you how many total nutrients you may have, what's kind of being stored by the bacteria, and what's available to your plants. And then we can work on those three things. Okay, so think about it this way. Different infographics, pictures help us to get what's going on. We have this big total of all the nutrients that could be available in my soil, and they come down to exchangeable, meaning that's in the process. So that's like in the factory. So this is the raw materials that are available. The mountain comes into the factory, that's exchangeable. And then the cars coming out the factory, well, that's the soluble. I can buy a car. Cool. Plant tissue test will be able to tell us those things. So why would we want to care about water-soluble nutrients anyway? Why don't we just put compost, forget about it? Because the issue is we don't know the nutrients in our food unless we're putting them there. And our soils, most of the places, especially if I have to take over a farm like Raktamachat in the beginning, and I know that it's been like 20 or 30 years, I don't know exactly, but they cut down the forest, and I know when they cut down the rainforest, they sold the trees and they burn everything. And so if I see the soil, there's no humic matter because it's a rainforest. And then at which time, 20 years, they just grew the same crop, corn, and all they did was spray chemicals on it. So at this point, I don't think there's anything there. So I'm not really convinced about how much minerals there are. And I care about minerals for my family. I want to feed healthy food to my family, to you. So I need to make sure that that what we're eating is grown in mineralized soil. So I need to do my soil test. And when I get my soil test, I go, wow, there's some deficiencies here. now I need to understand, and we're going to move towards, how do I recognize the deficiency, and how do I remineralize for that particular deficiency if I have it. So they're all the forms of minerals that we're going to look at are what plants pull in through the roots in the process that's called simple diffusion. So they diffuse the minerals through a process called simple diffusion, which is a cation-ion exchange between positive and negative ions. So it's an electrical exchange. So why do we care about that? Well, the organisms in the soil can make them plant available if you have a healthy food web. But if you don't have a healthy food web, the only way they could be available is through water-soluble, which we call synthetic fertilizers. Pelletized fertilizer is water-soluble. Then the plant can take it up because there's nothing in the soil. So yes, they can grow the corn, and they'll continue to do that as long as they want to by utilizing water-soluble, and the corn doesn't know the difference. So corn cannot tell the difference between elements on the periodic table, and neither can scientists. And no scientist from Germany to America to England to Australia can test for NPK. So how do they know if your farm is organic if they can't test whether you use NPK? Well, they come and they test your soil, and then they look and they say, wow, you've got loads of NPK in this soil. How is it possible through just regular composting regimes? Did you get that much nitrogen in the soil? You couldn't have possibly put it because it's way more than the plants need. So they test the soil and they say, that's just impossible. You could not have done that. And that's why I like to call it steroids. Like they test the steroid and they say, you have too much adrenaline in your system. No human makes that much adrenaline. So Lance Armstrong, you cheated, right? Or Mr. You say you're organic, but you're not organic because you've got too much nitrogen in there. Okay? The plant can only take up 100%. It can't take up 120%, so it takes up the max nitrogen that it wants, that's available. And whatever's left, if it's over the standardized amount, they say inorganic. So that's why we want to care about it. So we want to try organically to get our levels as high as we can. And that's why we're going to go through the things that we do every day, from our compost to our worms to our teas, so that we can get up to a highest, like, say, naturalized bodybuilding level, if you want, to use that analogy. So if we do this, we start to see these aggregates in more detail, what's going on in the aggregate. So inside the aggregate, we have quartz grains, or that's our minerals, right? So these mineral grains are being held together by this glue. Inside the glue, there's water, polysaccharides, and the bacteria. Those are called organic polymers. So the organic polymers are binding the minerals together. And then the bacteria is pulling the minerals off the grains, right? Through an ionic exchange, which we're going to see. So much of the chemical basis of soil structure lies in how the clays bind to each other in the soil. So we need clays and also chars. Chars can also do cation-ionic exchange. But sands and silts don't do it very well. Silts very poorly, sands not at all, and clay's the best. And arguably, the people argue on the internet about char. So I've read articles that are in journals that say, hey, that you can prove there's a cation-ionic exchange between char, and other people that say they don't believe that there is, and I don't know. I do know that when we add it, we get other benefits like structure, water retention, and if we have clay already, we're still going to have that. So I overall think it's better. So it may do it, may not, but it's still better. So why do we care about these exchangeable nutrients? To get air and water to move in the soil and then be held in the soil structures, clays must be flocculated. So we can't have flocculated clays to move minerals if we don't have the bacterial colonies. So we have to then focus on that. So when we put the focus back to the soil and we get the minerals to move, the plants are just a result of good soils. Good soils move nutrients. Plants are only made up of nutrients. Okay? So if we can move the nutrients, the plants grow well. Same thing for us. So to flocculate soils, the exchangeable calcium-magnesium ratio must be correct, given the type of clay. So we need to know the type of clay that we're dealing with. Okay, so your soil scientist, when you do the soil test, will tell you. Then they'll give you your calcium-magnesium ratios. So now I have a carbon-nitrogen ratio that's important. That creates my fungal to bacteria ratios. And I have a calcium to magnesium ratio. So what we're going to start to see when we do these ratios that there's always bound together. So two things have like a doppelganger. So if I see like the nitrogen, I'm having a problem with nitrogen, it's probably because there's some relationship to its like doppelganger, and that's where the problem is. And if I fix this, it'll fix that. So it's unable to, I have lots of nitrogen, but why are my plants, no, my plants aren't growing, and man, I got nitrogen, what's happening? Yeah, well, you probably have phosphorus deficiencies. This is a relationship. So I'm going to show you charts, which are very simple. This is all quite easy. And then you'll be able to just read, okay, that's cool, and that's what I'll work on. So let's look at this. What comes first if I want to build good soils? First, clays must be flocculated, meaning that we need bacteria to flocculate the clays. If we don't have flocculated clays, you cannot move the minerals. Next, those flocculated clays build what we call microaggregates. They get built, so they start sticking together and binding together, and that's where we start to see our compost having the granular structure. Okay, so if we have that, we're well on our way. Then they create macroaggregates, bigger and bigger blocks. They start sticking together. That creates air passages. So when we get the macroaggregates, they're more angular, and when they can't fit together, it creates the pores that the water and air can go through. So when they're really, really small, they're tight, but as they build, they keep pushing apart and they create the cavities. And that's where our water retention and air is. And then that's how your soil's working. So clays must be flocculated. What is that called? They get what's called two stable colloids. The colloids, okay, or the bacteria, have to bind. They bind with electrical charges, okay? So that's like a positive and a negative attraction. And then they start binding together and building up these things. So here we have destabilized colloids, meaning that they don't have the right ionic exchange. So they're like retracting each other. But when we get microfolic formation, they start to bind together. Okay, so it's just an attraction due to electrical charges. By the way, we'll look at later, our pH in the soil is only a measure of potential hydrogen. Potential hydrogen is a measure of electricity. So when we measure the pH, and then our plants liking different pHs, we're actually measuring the electrical charges in the soil. And you see how the electrical charge is tied to the mineral uptake. So then certain minerals only get uptake at certain electrical charges and or pHs. So the difference between plants that like acidic soils and plants that like alkaline soils, different mineral profiles, right? And that's why we need to eat a balanced diet of alkaline and acidic plants. So these 80-20 people, they're going to all die of old age really before they're old because their hair and their teeth are going to fall out. Well, that's okay because they only eat on one side. And here's what's the secret. One side is macronutrients. One side is micronutrients. pH is 7, right? Water is 0, 7, right? So we have to eat on both sides or we'll get a macronutrient deficiencies that cause diseases, or we get micronutrient deficiencies. But if we eat what's called a balanced diet, then we don't have nutrient deficiencies. And we'll look at that in more detail. So macroaggregates must be built. First step. That's building those macroaggregates. Air passageways must be present. Our larger anthropods, they do that. So these bugs, worms, these things help to do that. Or we can do it artificially to a certain extent by alleviating compaction with a hoe, for instance. So if that happens, water infiltrates easily into the soil and air moves. The worms facilitate air passages evenly. So air moves freely. So our soils actually breathe. So they expel air and intake air from the day to night. Okay, so and that's happening. The nutrient cycling occurs normally in these conditions. So anaerobic bacteria, okay, and fungi can grow normally. And protozoa, nematodes, and microflods consume the bacteria and fungi and release plant available nutrients. So we just start building up the blocks.